Hi everyone, welcome to our work with the Owens and Valesky text. We're going to continue on our journey in organizational theory, this time looking at chapter 2 that goes over the history of schools and school organization. The other thing that I'm going to do in this chapter that I think is worthwhile to all of you, I'm going to go over a good foundation of the history of the principalship in the history of education as well. I realize that different people come into this class with a different level of background, so for me, it's important for me to give you things that you might have seen elsewhere, or things you didn't see as part of your undergrad or master's degree. If you had a history of education class, none of this will be a surprise to you. But if you haven't had one, this is kind of stuff that kind of will help you frame your research a little bit better, so you have a good theoretical perspective when you're moving forward. So that's kind of my goal with what I'm doing here, and that's what I hope will help you throughout this class. So one of the things that I really mentioned is, we look over this difference between traditional and progressive education. This is common. This is a debate that you're going to see in many different educational circles, because in theory, if we're looking at it from one extreme to the other extreme, your traditional education is going to be concerned with your core academic subjects. And people say that that looks like, English, math, social studies, and science, but let's be honest, in the United States, it's really just English and math. Progressive education is more along the lines of your individualized education. What are we doing to create education as a whole for society and for individuals? So that's one of the debates that we're going to be looking at, and I think that's important because it's going to frame our perspective on the history of education. So I would encourage you to go over this chapter with your slides. I think it'll help you. But let's try to get an understanding in a basic of where education came from. The first real form of education in the United States happened in something called Dane Schools. These were basically schools that were run out of the home of a woman who looked exactly like that. She sat around, she taught children from the community basic education skills in order for them to function in society. You're going to note that a lot of what we talk about in here originated in England, and that's important, because a lot of our education system was all taken from European countries, but that's part of the way that education was formed in the United States. We always know that there were restrictions on women who were considered to be teachers. Pretty much had to be single, pretty much had to be celibate, couldn't go out, couldn't have any kind of a life, and that's sort of why we have a moral turpitude clause too in a lot of school districts in the United States. I find it very interesting that I come from Pennsylvania, and one of our laws in the state of Pennsylvania is moral turpitude, that a teacher or principal can be fired for it. It originated here in this Dane School concept because of the women who were serving as the teachers. So this was one approach and something to look at, and then we had apprenticeship programs. This was basically, I would argue this is the foundation of trade schools and vocational education in the United States. Children learned young that they were going to be involved with the trade, they were tracked in the trade, and that was kind of their life. You didn't become a carpenter, you didn't become a blacksmith by going to school to be a blacksmith. You had to partner up with somebody who already was one, or you had to be the firstborn son of the blacksmith or the postal worker or the person in the trade program. You would basically serve, do your duties as an apprentice, and move on. And think about the internships that you have to do to be principals and superintendents. Founded from here, this notion of apprenticeship programs kind of started our whole way of looking at internship programs, even student teaching. So charity schools. You have to understand something, and I don't mean this as a knock on religion or religious institutions, but you have to understand that in order for schools to give something to people, they have to get something back. We were educating white male landowners' children, and mostly men in the 1700s, 1800s. Religious institutions stepped in and said, we'll teach anybody, we'll take whoever you have, but in exchange, we're going to teach you religion as well. This kind of has been used throughout the world to spread religion, spread Christianity, basically to give students access to education who don't have it, but they do it in a way that forces them to learn the Bible and teaches them a religious lifestyle. It spreads the religion and it spreads the cause, and it provides a form of education. So once again, like everything else, there are trade-offs, just if I was talking about school funding. The notion of town schools, I'll briefly mention this. This was basically saying that this was a community-based school where teachers came to locations and students learned, and it was basically the foundation in procedures of school boards more than anything else. So these were local schools, basically districted where kids went to school, and that caused town schools. Moving schools, I think this is an important concept to talk about when we're looking at Oklahoma. Moving schools where the teacher would come to poor rural areas that didn't have much access, they'd come in, they'd teach, they'd step in, and they'd be a part of the community for a little bit, and then they'd move on. So the teacher traveled, the teacher moved, thus the school and the concept of schooling moved with them as well. Then we had the notion of the district school. The district school was a single community house, in some places, to multiple rooms, where townships basically sent the kids to get whatever schooling they needed to be successful. Most of the time it had to do with trades, farming, crafts, things like that. Attendance wasn't required. Students would come when they had the opportunity to come, and when coming to school made sense to them. Then we had the notion of common schools. You need to know that common schools was the birth of compulsory education. A lot of you are going to be talking about the common schools movement and Horace Mann. This was basically saying that all children deserve the right to be educated. Everybody watching this video can agree that all kids deserve the right to be educated, but the problem we get into is when we debate quality of education. What I feel is one quality of education might be different from what you feel is quality education. How a school provides for people and what a school offers, that can be challenging as well. So even though we had common school and everybody was supposed to go to school, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody received the same equal treatment in school. Latin grammar schools is exactly what it sounds like. It prepared students for college through learning Latin grammar. Students learned Latin and Greek so they could be able to read the Bible, and so they could also learn all the classic works of literature. This is what children would do if they were going to be tracked to be college students eventually. They would have to learn 2 different Romance languages in order to be successful. You would learn also, in addition to academic skills, how to be a student, because it was assumed that by attending these, you would not only go to college, but you would become a scholar as well and teach others. Notice the difference between Latin grammar schools and English grammar schools. And we'll leave this up for a minute, and then we'll go back and we'll look at the Latin grammar school. So if you notice, the English grammar school was more or less focused on handwriting and grammar, proficiency in math, but also military training to help people function in society. So the Latin grammar school said, you're going to college. The English grammar school said, we're preparing you to be effective in society. How did you learn how to write and how did you learn how to read in English grammar school? Well, I got a book on me. This is basically what would happen. I'd hold the book up and I would say, okay, we're going to learn how to read and write today. Copy it. And I'd walk away, I'd sit at my desk, and I'd probably read. That was what the English grammar school looked like originally, which kind of led to this whole emphasis and notion of what is appropriate pedagogy for teaching. So then, we have the American Academy, which I would argue is the predecessor to the first high school. This is basically telling us that, you can do either. You can be somebody who attends who attends college, or you can be somebody who attends who goes straight to work. And they did this in a way really to direct for either future employment or potential college training. So it gave both options. So my argument that I make, this is really what the first high school looked like. It was this notion of the American Academy. We were giving kids choice, which still exists in the United States today. So my dissertation really looked at what principals do in their job. I wanted to see what principals that were considered to be stressed did. I wanted to see what low-stress principals did, and I wanted to see what part of their day was engaged in different activities. In order for me to justify that, I had to frame it looking at the history of the principalship, meaning that I was able to say, this is what principals did in the 1970s, this is what principals did in the 1980s, and this is how the job has not only changed, but gotten more difficult. So I'm going to briefly go over the eras of the principalship to help you try to understand this a little bit better as well. So one of the concepts that you're going to hear me say a lot in this class comes from two of my friends, Bob Johnson and Sharon Cruz. It's this notion of levels of abstraction. One of the things that you have to keep in mind as principals or superintendents is that if you internally get promoted throughout your school district, where it's just going to be, you're in the same place all of the time, you're only going to know the vision from your district, and it's going to be one level that's just all that you see. That's your world, that's your system. I come from an early childhood perspective, so I would always relate this to Bronfenbrenner in the micro system, the macro system, the mesosystem, in the exosystem, because you're only focused on what's in your world and your environment, and then the other factors kind of influence that. So for school principals, I encourage you to understand how things look in different organizations, and I think that's fairly important as well. So when we talk about the foundations of the principalship, there are a couple of names that I want you to keep in mind. I want you to keep Joe Murphy in mind. Joe Murphy is one of the leading scholars in the United States. He's done a lot of work on the history of the principalship, what roles principals have done over time. Jim Spallon, he did time sampling studies on what principals actually do. Dan Lorty is a historian, and he wrote a book called The Principal that's very prominent. And then Kate Bruce Meir, who's at Miami University of Ohio. She's more of a social justice person, but she has one of the most prolific articles on the role of the principal that I think is stellar. And she wrote it in 2007, but it doesn't really relate to the work that she does now. But I guarantee you it's probably one of the most enlightening articles you're ever going to read on the history of the principalship. Foundations of the principalship were basically, the principal, all that they did was they made sure the students behaved, they managed the building, they rang a bell at the beginning of the day and the end of the day, and that was it. That's what our principals did. They were the most experienced individual in the building with the most amount of seniority, and that was kind of what their job was. In 1906 was when we first said that people should be certified to be principals. Schools were centralized at the state level, meaning that you learn how to be a principal in the state of Pennsylvania, in the state of Oklahoma, in the state of Florida. You don't learn how to be a principal to serve the United States. The tests are specific to each state, which all of you know that. That's why we have the Oklahoma principal testing that goes on and that takes place. But this took 40 years to really certify everybody to be school administrators and for states to have formalized plans and formalized standards. But we basically trained people how to be building managers. That's what the first principals really looked like. So what did the principal do? The principal is the person who did basically the clerical duties. They supervised the teachers that were in the building. They did the building management. Most research on the principalship was directed at how can they effectively manage school buildings and what needs to be done to keep the school building afloat and treated properly. Not until the 60s and 70s did we really start talking about social justice and social reform. Right now, today, social justice in education in schools is a hot button topic, but I would argue that it really didn't start until the 60s and 70s. This is really when we were looking at ways to improve the learning opportunities for students so principals could get more involved in the lives of students and create good and positive opportunities for students to learn. So principals had less control over their building. Central administrators and school boards kind of took control. Race and gender became an issue with admittance into the principalship, but I would argue that that's more regional than national in context. We're going to talk a lot in here about this concept and this idea of the glass ceiling in education. I question the glass ceiling in education because you have to make sure that you contextualize it appropriately. Is there a glass ceiling on women achieving the role of superintendent in the United States? Yes, 100%, absolutely. Is there a glass ceiling on women becoming high school principals? Yes, it's actually even more difficult. Is there a pay differential between women and men in education? Yes, absolutely. But if you look at principals across the United States, there are more female principals than male principals, but it's also because we have more elementary schools than we do high schools. So if you do anything on gender studies, it's imperative that you at least frame it correctly and you show where the disconnect is and where that separation is. If you say we have less women in administration than men, sure, that might be true when you take into account central administration, but it doesn't fit for the role of the principal in principalship. If you say female principals make less than male principals, kind of, but there's other contexts that are a part of that. Females are more likely to be elementary school principals, and high school principals make more money. Make sure that you frame it appropriately, and the same goes with race. You're more likely to see a minority principal in a low-income in an urban area, and in some cases they're actually going to make more money because they're in a harder-to-manage building. So once again, that's another consideration that you have to take into account when you're looking at this stuff. So, 60s and 70s also said that said principals were also going to be involved in things like teen pregnancy, drug and alcohol use, and racial tension. And I laugh at that because we had stuff like Head Start and model schools reform, and obviously in Oklahoma, you say Head Start, we're one of the leaders in the world on preschool education, which is awesome. But I laugh because more and more and little to nothing is being removed from what they expect the principal to do. We just keep piling it on and packing it on, which kind of causes issues. So then we had the accountability era. In the accountability era, really that was framed through A Nation at Risk that came out in 1983. Nation at Risk is one of the most prevalent pieces of work that you'll probably read in education. You probably all looked at this in your school reform class, but it basically professed ways that we could reform and improve schools, what our fears and what our challenges was, but it also focused on the back to basics movement as well. With accountability, power became localized with boards and superintendents, and less power went to teachers and principals. School districts felt more pressure, and then the principals had less power than any other administrators because they were facing problems with unions, problems with school boards, problems with superintendents, and the principal truly was the person in the middle, which that in itself also creates a challenge. When you have a school principal who is the individual in the middle, you're going to lose out on a lot of the opportunities as well. So instructional leadership, this is one of the biggest buzzwords in all of education. We expect our principals to be instructional leaders, meaning that they have to set the mission and the vision for the school, they have to manage the instructional program, they have to promote professional development and learning, but yet they still have to manage a building. So I keep saying this, can you see the challenges? Because the challenges keep going and they keep getting there. My research really looks at time management and time concerns of principals. And even though we were doing instructional leadership, it's still discipline, it's still interactions with parents that are causing principals the most time and the most stress. So is there a problem with this? Well, I would argue yes. I would argue there's absolutely a problem with this. So I'll end and then we'll continue with part 2 on the next part of the video. But now we're looking at this notion of 21st century skills era. This is basically saying that, our goal is, in addition to everything else, we have to give students the skills to get to the next level while still being instructional leaders, while still running social justice, while still managing a building. So now you're responsible, too, for finding the next step, moving your students forward. So once again, please see kind of how the eras of the principalship have evolved and the directions they've gone in the United States.